turn with me to Leviticus the 23rd chapter. I think that's one you're familiar with. Leviticus chapter 23, where you have a list of the feasts of the Lord. And it says, we're going to begin in verse 5, says, on the 14th day of the first month, this translation says, I'm using the New King James today. I'm using it for a purpose, but nevertheless, I'll tell you in just a little while why. At twilight, it says in this translation, is the Lord's Passover. Now the word twilight here is in the Hebrew ben harbiim, and it means between the evenings. And I'll say up front, I'm not going to get into this in depth in this subject, but we've talked about it in the past, and you may recall that ben harbiim, between the evenings, does not mean the beginning of the day. It refers to the latter part of the day. Now again, I can go into scriptures and I could show you reasons for that conclusion, but I'm not going to get into that so much today. But I'll just, for the time being, take for granted that's what it means. So on the 14th day of the first month, ben harbiim, between the evenings, is the Lord's Passover. Now, what is the calendar date? The 14th. You got it. I'm glad you were listening. On the 14th day, and on the, verse 6, and on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord. What day? 15th. Is 15th the 14th? No. 15th comes after the 14th. Okay, so when is the Passover? The Lord's Passover occurs on what day? The 14th. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first day occurs when? The 15th. Kind of clear, isn't it? Nothing ambiguous about this text. And it says 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day, and which day would that be on the calendar date? The 15th, correct. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall do no customary work on it. But you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days, the seventh day. Now if it's the first day is the 15th, the seventh day would be, let's see, 15th, 16th, 17th, the 21st, right? The 21st. The seventh day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So the first day, which is and the seventh day, which is our high days, our holy days. And the day preceding the 15th is the 14th, of course. And what occurs on that day? The Lord's Passover. Okay. We got it, don't we? I think we do. I think we have it. So now then, with that in mind, I want you to turn with me to Matthew, the 26th chapter, Matthew chapter 26. And let's read in verse 17. Verse 17. Now on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when is that? The 15th, right? On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? No, wait a minute. Hold on. If it's the 15th, aren't they a little bit late? Day late and $1 short? So what's going on here? What is this? Well, let's see if Mark can help us out a little bit. Let's look at Mark's account. Mark 14. You'll find it there. Mark chapter 14. And Mark says in verse 12, now on the first day of unleavened bread. When is that? The 15th, right? That's what it says in the Old Testament. Leviticus 23 says it. When they killed the Passover, wait a minute. When they killed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover? Boy, what in the wide, wide world of sports is going on here? Can anybody figure it out? Well, let's see if Luke can help us out a little bit. Luke, can you help us? Chapter 22, Luke 22, verse 7 says, then came the day of unleavened bread when the Passover must be killed. No help, Luke. That's basically the same thing. You seem to be saying the same thing the others are saying, although it's a little different here. Then came the day, singular, of unleavened bread when the Passover must be killed. Now, if you go back, again, back in the Leviticus 23, if you take that for what it says, on that first day, the day after the 14th, and on the 14th is when the Passover is killed, We can see that. I'll show you that in just a few moments. But on the day after that, that's when the Passover was killed. And then the 15th, that's when the night of the 15th, that's when the meal took place. But this, if you look at the way it's worded here in the Synoptic Gospels, it's kind of confusing. Can you see why some people get confused on this? It's a little confusing, isn't it? Well, just to show you, just to reiterate the point that the Passover is on the 14th, not the 15th, but the 14th. I want to read several scriptures. I have them listed already in this article, so I'll just read right out of Numbers 9, verses 2 and 3. Let the children of Israel keep the Passover at its appointed time. And here it is. On the 14th day of this month, that's the first month of the year, between the evenings, Ben Harbiim, you shall keep it at its appointed time. Numbers 9 and verse 5. And they kept the Passover. When did they do it? On the 14th day of the first month between the evenings, Ben Harbiim, in the wilderness of Sinai. So this is the second year after they came out of Egypt. Leviticus 23 verse 5, already we read that says on the 14th day, as we know, of the first month between the evenings is the Lord's Passover. Then Exodus 12 and verse 6, we get a little bit, this kind of tells us what it means by keeping the Lord's Passover. Exodus 12 verse 6 says, now you shall keep it, that's the Passover lamb, until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it between the evenings, Ben Harbiim. So what happens on the 14th day between the evenings? The killing, the sacrifice of the Passover. Now I'll mention this in passing. I don't know if I'll comment further on it later, but I'll mention this, at least for now, in passing. And that is that from the get-go, from the time that the wilderness, the first Passover in the wilderness, it was a sanctuary-centered sacrifice like all other sacrifices that God instituted in Israel. All of them were sanctuary-centered. There were no domestic sacrifices, meaning the people didn't go out outside their tents or their dwellings and just go out and offer an animal on their own altar out there someplace. They had to go to the tabernacle. It had to be presented there on that one altar. Everybody had to do that. It pertained to every sacrifice offered, and that was the place where God's name was placed. It was at the tabernacle. Some people later would say, well, it's any place in Jerusalem. No, it's at the tabernacle, or later the temple. That's where God's name was placed. That's where the Shekinah glory was. And that's where the sacrifices were all offered, including the Passover sacrifice. This article goes into that. And we've talked about it here in the past, of course. So now then, though, back to Luke here. Luke, as I said, doesn't give us a whole lot of help. He seems to, he might suggest something maybe a little different from the others, maybe not. But we do see a clue here in Luke's Gospel in the first verse of chapter 22. He says, now the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew near, which is called the Passover. Ah, there's a clue. There's a clue. The Feast of Unleavened Bread drew near, which is called the Passover. Leviticus 23 doesn't say anything like that, does it? No, it doesn't. Throughout the Old Testament, you see the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Passover over and over and over again on the 14th between the evenings. And that's when the sacrifice occurred. The Feast of Unleavened Bread on the 15th. Always on the 15th, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The 21st is the 7th day. So here, though, in Luke's Gospel, it says the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew near, and he tells us it's also called the Passover. So what do we have going on? It's simple etymology. Simple etymology. That's the study of the evolution of terms and phrases and languages. As time goes on, the terms that we use, the phrases we use, they change, don't they? We've seen things change in our lifetimes. And you go back, you can go back to the old King James version of the Bible and look at that old English, and boy, has the language changed. And certain terms had one meaning then, have a very different meaning now. And so after a while, things change. Language changes. And the terminology we use changes. This is evolution of words. and the changes in word meaning. These things happen over time. So Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover are now used interchangeably. By the New Testament period, those terms are used interchangeably because it was commonly recognized that the two were very closely connected. You just read the story, Exodus 12, you can't miss that. So the two were connected, and these terms are now used interchangeably. So when you read about the first day of Feast of Unleavened Bread, we'll throw in something else here in just a little bit. It's not necessarily talking about the 15th. It could include the 14th when the Passover sacrifice was offered. Could it not? Does that make sense? It makes perfectly good sense since these terms are now used interchangeably at least in large measure. Now, the same is true today, that these terms in the Jewish community are still used interchangeably. But this generates a lot of confusion, I get to the question every year. I received it this year already and have answered it. But at least one person will write in or call and ask, said, I'm confused. It says, here on you guys, the Holy Day calendar you publish, you're having Passover one day and then the Jews have it on the next day. What's going on there? I'm just confused over that. Well, those people are not the only, a lot of times they're church members. This most recent one was from a church member. And the church member's not the only one to get confused over that. Some Jews get confused over it when they read in the Bible that the Passover is on the 14th. This is from a website called Chabad.org. It's spelled C-H-A-B-A, like it's Shabbat, it's Chabad, at Guttural's Chabad.org. And the question here is, why is Passover on Nisan 15, not Nisan 14? This is a Jewish publication. And this is an article written by Yehuda Sherpin. Does that sound like an Irish name? No, I think that's a Jewish name for sure. So this is a Jewish publication. Says the question, the person writes in and explains he's of Jewish ancestry, but of course he's not been an observant Jew, but now he's becoming an observant Jew. He wants to get back to his roots, and he's going to, for the first time, to have, or at least he's going to have this year, a bona fide Seder for his family. And so he started reading the Tanakh, and he runs into a problem there. He says, I'm confused, however, regarding when to celebrate. In a number of places in the Bible, it states that Passover is on the 14th of Nisan. Yet the Jewish calendar shows Passover starting the following night, which is already the 15th of Nisan. How come? How come, he says. Now, before I get into the answer, I'll just mention this, that some time back I had someone who was communicating with me on this subject, and he's telling me how sad it is that, and this is someone advocating the early 14th Passover and claiming that the Passover was one feast, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is something else. Passover remembers that night of terror in Egypt, and it's supposed to be a somber time when people remember that horrible time, the horrible cries of Egypt when the firstborn were being slain all across the land. And that the Passover is time to whoop it up, though, because that's a celebration of the Exodus. They said, how sad that the Jews have merged those two and made it into a celebration of the Exodus. And in that discussion, I said, what are you talking about? The Jews do recognize the significance of the 14th. Furthermore, I pointed out to him Deuteronomy chapter 16. He's claiming the Passover is not a celebration of the Exodus, but only a memorial of that night of terror in Egypt. But it says in Deuteronomy 16, verse 1, observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover to the Lord your God. For in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. So what is Passover connected with? What is it a celebration of? The Exodus. You can't separate those two. It was the Passover. It's what happened that night of terror. It's what happened that night when the firstborn were struck dead in Egypt that caused Pharaoh to finally surrender and let the people go. That was a part of the Exodus. And of course, it's a part of this overall celebration. So anyway, back to the reply here. This is a good question. And you can understand why. You have a Jewish person wanting to get back to his roots, and he looks at the calendar, the Jewish calendar. It has Passover as occurring on the 15th of Nisan or Abib, and yet the Bible says over and over it's on the 14th. So the reply is this. In response to your question, you're correct that the Torah refers to Passover on the 14th, but it also refers to the festival of Matzah, or in other words, a Feast of Unleavened Bread, on the 15th. So they know that. There's no question about that. And he's going to give a very good explanation here as to why all that is and how they approach it. He says, why the discrepancy? Let's examine these verses from Leviticus 23. And then I'll just read their translation. It's a little different from the one I read a little while ago. It says, in the first month, on the 14th of the month, in the afternoon, the Passover is the Passover to the Lord. And on the 15th day of that month is the festival of matzahs to the Lord. You shall eat matzahs for a 7-day period, or unleavened bread. He says, so he goes on to say, so what is this Passover on the 14th? He says, it is not the festival of matzahs, since that only begins that evening, since the Jewish days begin at nightfall. Rather, it is the Passover offering, and he is right. Absolutely right. We read it for ourselves in the Bible, in Exodus 12. That is when the Passover was offered. And by the way, it was not just an animal that was killed. This is slaughtered out there someplace, as I said earlier. It was offered to God in sacrifice. Now, not in Egypt. Of course, Egypt was the original event. We're talking about later, when the tabernacle was erected and when the priesthood was put in place. So he says this was the offering, which was slaughtered on the 14th. On the 14th, they recognize that. And eaten that night, the 15th, together with matzah and the onset of the festival of matzahs. So yes, that is correct. And then he talks about the name change. As I mentioned, this is normal, typical etymology. He says, oddly, although the week-long celebration is consistently called the Festival of Matzahs in the Torah, it has come to be known as Pesach or Passover in common parlance and even in our liturgy. Yeah, that's but the point I want to make here is this is not just a modern thing. It's in the New Testament itself. It's in the New Testament. By that time, you already see the use of both terms to pertain to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They both were kind of merged together in one sense. And then he goes into some question. Some part of this I'll skip over. He explains how that came about and so on. And then he talks about the long day, how they look at it, how they look on the 14th. The 14th they consider because in Leviticus 7 and verse 15 it says, and he gives a quotation here, and the flesh of his thanksgiving peace offering shall be eaten on the day it is offered. He shall not leave any of it over until morning. He uses that to establish a principle for the Passover. And since he goes on to say that if on a given day you're given a day to eat an offering, you make the offering, you're given a day to eat it, and it said nothing is to remain over till the morning. Well, that means you offer it evidently in the afternoon, and you eat it. You're still eating it that night. That means that night, even though technically it's a new calendar date, it's still considered to be an extension of that day. So he goes on to explain that in their way of thinking, in Jewish tradition, that the 15th, the night of the 15th, is an extension of the 14th, even though it is technically the 15th, because it still involves that one sacrifice. The one sacrifice is then eaten at that time. So he says, so he goes on to explain some more about that, but then he gets into the celebration of the 14th of Nisan. This is what they do today. Now, this is no doubt from an Orthodox perspective. You have different Jewish groups. You have the conservative synagogues. You have the Reformed synagogues. Those are the liberals. You have many, many Jews who are non-observant. You'll find them eating bacon and doing all kinds of things, eating things that are not kosher and not practicing the holy days and all of that. And then you have the Orthodox. So I'm sure this is from an Orthodox perspective, and I'm not sure that all Orthodox agree 100%. You have different views, but you have this within Judaism today, within the Jewish community. This concept is there concerning the 14th of Nisan. And this addresses the question of, or the comment that someone had once, that it's sad that the Jews don't recognize the 14th. Actually, they do. They do, very much they do. And I'll tell you this. If a temple were rebuilt in Jerusalem, let's suppose that happens. I mean, to me, I can't imagine it given the situation, but let's suppose that the day comes in our lifetimes and that temple is built and a priesthood is sanctified, and once again sacrifices are being offered there. And of course, there's going to be a whole lot of objection to it, even within the Jewish community. Because you have a lot of vegans, you have a lot of Jews that don't believe all those things, but you have a lot of them that do. But let's suppose that it really was rebuilt and there was a priesthood in place, and what do you think would happen on the 14th? Do you think it's something nobody would ignore? No, I'll guarantee you, the news networks would be there. You would see the cameras. You'd see a massive crowd of people gathering with their year-old lambs coming to that temple, that one place, and it would be announced all over the world that this is Pesach. It's Passover. It's the sacrifice of the Passover. And that would be probably, arguably, the most important day of the Jewish liturgical year. And it would be huge. It would be broadcast all over the world. And you would have Jews who were able to do it would be traveling there with their sacrifices, or maybe they'd purchase it there, their year-old blemishless lamb, and offer it there at the temple. That's what would happen. So the 14th would be huge. But even today, when there is no temple, let me read here what he says about that. He says, today, even though the temple has been destroyed and we no longer offer Passover sacrificial lambs, or other sacrifices for that matter, it would be quite unlawful to do so. That's my comment. But he goes on to say, the Passover, or the 14th of Nisan, is not forgotten. Indeed, it still has practical implications for us. And he goes on, point number 1, the Torah tells us that we were not to sacrifice the lamb while we had leavened bread in our possession. Now, he cites Leviticus 23 and verse 18, which says, you shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread. Now, he takes that to mean, the Jewish community, or at least the Orthodox, take that to mean that you're not to have leavened bread in your possession at the time the Passover lambs are beginning to be offered. He says, even in our times, we rid ourselves of all leaven before midday of the 14th of Nisan, the time when the sacrifice was once brought. So midday, between the evenings, what's his name? One of the Jewish authors, it's not Josephus, but anyway, I should have written it down it's just not on the top of my list of names in my brain right now. But in any case, he mentioned this was someone who was actually wrote before the time of the apostles. Philo. That's who I'm thinking about. I don't know how I could have forgotten that. But anyway, he mentions that he talks about the Passover sacrifice. He was an Alexandrian Jew, but he's talking about the Passover sacrifice, and he says that it occurred from noon till eventide. So that's just one source that affirms that. Now, number 2, let me get back to the article here. Number 2, he says, additionally, the day that one would bring a sacrifice in the temple was considered a minor holiday, meaning holy day. And people would refrain from working. Now get this, you may not have known this. Today, we still refrain from doing work on the 14th. Were you aware of that? This work restriction is not the same as a full-on holiday or holy day. You may make any preparations you need for the holiday that will begin that night on the 15th. If you need to do other kinds of work, please feel free to discuss the specifics with a rabbi. See, you need to get permission before you do anything else, in other words. So talk about it to a rabbi who should have knowledge of these things and should give you direction in that regard. So that's the way they look at it, because this is, John's gospel, we're going to see in a little while, he calls this same day the preparation of the Passover. The preparation of the Passover. And that's exactly what he's describing here. And they regard that as a minor holy day. It's not as holy as the full-on holy days, but it's because it's very important lead up to the night of the 15th, which is a holy day. Okay, and I understand their reasoning on that and how that developed as a tradition. Point number 3, he says, many also reenact, quote unquote, the day's sacrifices by reading how it would take place in the temple. You can find a standard text printed in Kabad Siddur, and you can, that's some of their publications, and you can supplement it with as much additional detail as you wish. So that's something that's encouraged, that you reenact it by reading about it on that day. So they don't ignore the 14th. They are very much aware of the 14th. It's just that there is no temple, no priesthood, so they can't offer the sacrifices that pertain to that day. He says, our observance of the 14th of Nisan are also an expression of our fervent hopes and prayers that the temple be rebuilt speedily in our days and we once again bring an actual Passover lamb on that day. As we conclude in the Passover Haggadah, next year in Jerusalem. That's a common saying among observant Jews especially. Next year in Jerusalem. And one of the references is to the restoring of the temple, the restoring of the sacrifices, and above all, the Passover sacrifice, which is the memorial of that great redemptive event of their ancestors having been brought out of Egyptian bondage and them having been therefore established as a nation in the Holy Land after that. So that's I thought you'd find that interesting and relevant to the topic and to some of the questions that come up regarding it. But now let's get back to Matthew 26. But before we do, before we actually look at the text, I want to go to John's Gospel, and let's look at chapter 13. John chapter 13. Now, what I just read from Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22, here John describes the same thing. And you're going to see that John uses some different terminology from the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptics speak of the 14th, obviously it's the 14th, we'll get into that later, but they speak of that as the first day of unleavened bread, or the first of the unleavened, since obviously that was the day that the leavening was completely put out, and that was the day the sacrifice of the Passover took place. So that was the first day of this Passover festival. Okay? Now, in John 13, John is talking about that same night that Jesus took the bread and the wine when he gathered with his disciples, what we just read, what we're beginning to read in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22. That same night, and this is how John puts it, John 13, verse 1. Now, before the feast of the Passover. That's interesting, isn't it? The others seem to put it on the first day of unleavened bread, and yet here John says it's before the feast of the Passover. He has a little different perspective on it, doesn't he? Now, scholars take a look at this, and forever they have acknowledged the difference between the Synoptic Gospels and John's Gospel. And many of them are comfortable in saying, well, it's just a contradiction. It's a contradiction. They had Jesus, the Synoptics had Jesus observing the Passover as the other Jews did, and then he was crucified on the high day. And you know what? There are a lot of people today believe that. I've run across that even among Church of God people and in the Messianic movement. But here John, as the scholars say, but John says this was before the Feast of the Passover. So he has a different perspective. I say, since I believe in inspiration of Scripture, I say that these differences can be resolved. That there's not really a contradiction, it's just a different use of language. A different use of language. So John says that before the Feast of the Passover, and interestingly, he describes this night as the same night Judas betrayed him, and he doesn't even mention the bread and the wine. He just mentions the washing of the disciples' feet. And then he has this long section here, from chapter 13 to 14, 15, 16, 17. And we often read that when we come to memorialize the death of Christ. We often read from at least portions of these chapters. And then I want you to turn on over, though. Look at, as the story continued, all of this happened in the night of his betrayal. And yet it's interesting, John doesn't even mention the institution of the memorial, the bread and the wine. And then look at John 18, look at verse 28. This is after the betrayal, and now then they're taking Jesus away. It said, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas, that's the high priest, to the praetorium, and it was early morning. Understand, this is the 14th, early in the morning on the 14th. So anybody who says that the disciples came to Jesus on the first, the first of unleavened, meaning the morning of the 14th, and some people have concluded that, well, you have a contradiction here because he's already being led away in the early morning hours. But they, the Jews here, themselves did not go into the praetorium. This is a Roman place, and it'd be defiled by going in there, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. So they hadn't eaten it, had they? Now some people look at that and say, well, yeah, they hadn't had time to eat it yet, but it was normally eaten the night before. No, it wasn't. No, they didn't want to get themselves defiled because they wanted to eat the Passover that would be offered later that day and eaten that night. And they would defile themselves from their point of view if they went into the praetorium. Now then, let's look at we're just not going to read a lot of text here, but let's look at chapter 19, and first of all, verse 14. Now this is the day of the crucifixion, understand. It says, now it was the preparation day of the Passover. That's interesting, isn't it? The preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, behold, this Pilate said to the Jews, behold your king. Now then, also in chapter 19, look on down to verse 31. Therefore, because it was the preparation day, this is the 14th, the day of the crucifixion, it was the preparation day that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath. Now some people say, see, it was a Friday. It was Friday. But he goes on, and parenthetically he says, for that Sabbath was a high day. Now some say, well, yeah, that weekly Sabbath was also a high day. No, what he means here is that He's explaining that was not your regular weekly Sabbath. It was a high day Sabbath, meaning an annual high day. So they wanted to it was the preparation day, the preparation of the Passover, and the bodies, they didn't want them to remain on the cross or on the stake, whatever you want to call it, because the high day would be coming on pretty soon, and they're not to remain on the stake on the high day. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. In verse 42, so this is after Jesus was found to be dead already. His legs were not broken, so they took him down, and now then he was put in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Verse 42 says, so there they laid Jesus because of the Jews' preparation day, for the tomb was nearby. Now the reason I use King James, some of these words are in italic, like preparation day. Day is in italics, meaning the preparation. And obviously it's talking about the preparation of the Passover. So this was the day, again, that the Passover lambs were killed. And interesting, isn't it, that Jesus dies at about the time the Passovers were normally being killed? Some people seem to want to think it's more important to place Jesus, to have the Last Supper, that he was actually eating the Passover lamb there, that's more important than his dying. at the time the Passovers were being offered. To me, that's significant because it's significant simply because we know that Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed for us. And that He fills full, to say He fulfilled the Passover, He fills full the meaning of that offering. So how appropriate is it that His death would occur at the same time that those lambs would normally be being offered? Okay, so to me that all makes perfectly good sense. Now, as I said, we'd go back to Matthew 26. Let's go back and see if we can make heads or tails of some of these things, because they are confusing on the surface. If you don't have all that background information, now if I didn't have John's Gospel telling me a little bit more about, to give me some additional facts, and if I wasn't aware of etymology, I would think that that the disciples came to Jesus on the 14th, probably in the morning of the 14th, and they said, where should we prepare to keep the Passover? And then they went and made preparation, and probably later on in the afternoon they went to the temple with their sacrifices, and then that evening they got together. This would be the beginning of the 15th, and they had the Passover. I would think that's what Matthew was telling us, Mark and Luke. I would think that. But because you have John adding these details, I'm not thinking that anymore. Not thinking that. In fact, I don't believe they had a lamb that night. I don't believe this was an early statutory Passover. Why do I believe that? Number one, how could they have done it? How could they have had a lamb that night? Because the lambs were offered at the temple the next day. And according to the law, that's the only place they were to be offered. Do you think Jesus was offering a domestic sacrifice outside the temple someplace? I don't. Do you think He would do something that was unlawful? No, I don't. And He had His disciples do that? I don't believe that He did. So I don't believe there was a lamb. I don't believe this was an early sacrifice. Furthermore, I don't believe that, I once believed that the temple authorities were probably accommodating to different points of view. Now I don't believe that anymore. They were not. Because things had to be done strictly. The Sanhedrin, the ruling body, were very strict, I would say, on how things were done, when things were done. For example, they're the ones who sent out the instructions on, or they made the determination when the new moon was, when the first of the month was. And there was a time anciently when the way they would send that information out to the diaspora, they didn't pull out their cell phones and give them a call. They didn't get on the walkie-talkies or anything like that. They didn't have anything like that. How in the world could the rabbinic authorities in Jerusalem get information to Jews in Babylon? How did that happen? Well, it had a very simple system. They had designated mountaintops in these different locations, from Jerusalem to Babylon, for example, designated mountaintops. And what would happen in Jerusalem from the designated mountaintop, the Jews in these other designated mountaintops would know right where to look. They'd build a big fire, and they'd see the fire and the smoke going up from it, and that was the key, that was the signal that it's the new moon. And the Jerusalem authorities would determine that. And then the next mountaintop on down, some good many miles away, but still, not so far that the fire from this mountaintop would be invisible. This mountaintop, the first one, they'd build a fire. And they'd see it from the next mountaintop, and then they'd build a fire. And then the next mountaintop, they'd see it, and they'd build a fire. And hey, pretty quickly, the Jews in Babylon knew it was the new moon. Didn't take that long to do that. I mean, you can see this little chain of communication going on. And then later on, what happened at some point, you see the Samaritans, they rejected rabbinic authority, and they had a different calendar too. And what they would do, they'd build their own fires in the mountaintop, and that would confuse the Jews on down the road. And so it led to confusion, and ultimately they had to abandon that and come up with something different. And out in the 4th century, that's why you have a calculated calendar. That's part of the reason, because it keep everybody in sync. You know, when you have an ancient time like that, and communication, widespread communication from Jerusalem to the Jews and the diaspora, there's a problem. You got to make sure your communication is clear and quick. So the best way to do that is to publish a calculated calendar everybody could have. That way they could know, and authorized by the rabbinic authority, they would know when the new moon fell. So that's the way it was done anciently. But anyway, I kind of got off the topic there. Ran off into a different thing there. But back in Matthew chapter 26, again, I'm going to read through some of this. Verse 17 again. Now on the first of the unleavened, the day of the feast is not in the, well, it's in italics in this translation. So it would read, now on the first of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying to him, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? Now I believe, based on what Luke tells us, the fact that these terms Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread were used interchangeably, I believe the disciples had two things in mind. First of all, they knew they were going to have a meal that night. They had a meal every night. So they had that meal. That was a part of, since now the 14th had begun, that was a part of the Passover festival. Okay? It was a Passover meal. Not the Passover meal, not the lamb, but a Passover meal. But I also think that they believed that they would be there the following night, the following day, the 14th, that they would offer their sacrifices at the temple, and then they would eat the sacrifice of the Passover that night. And probably, it says it was a large room that they rented, that they got, and probably have family members join them, because Passover was traditionally a family occasion. That's another thing. This kind of seems odd that you have only these 12 there. Where are their wives? They can stay home. No, it seems odd, but I would say that in all probability the disciples had in mind of being there that night with their teacher, and then they would offer the sacrifice the next day, and their families would join them the next night for the Passover. So he said, when they say, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? I think they had all of that in mind. And he said, go into a city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. Now, keeping the Passover was not just that one event of eating the Passover lamb. It was the whole festival. That's part of keeping the Passover. So he would begin keeping the Passover festival that evening with his disciples. And then, of course, the disciples, thinking that they would also, the next day, would be offering, on the 14th, would be offering the sacrifice, and that night, the 15th, would be eating the sacrifice. So he said, go to the city. He says, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. I mean, they prepared for this occasion, this event. Not only that night, but they were thinking in terms of where they were going to be for at least a day or two. Now this is interesting here. When evening had come, he sat down with the disciples. So wait a minute. It says now, back in verse 17, on the first of the unleavened, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we understand that now to be the 14th, don't we? Yet it says when evening had come. How does that work? Sounds to me, here's my best shot at that. I think that when they actually came to Jesus and said, where do you want us to prepare for the Passover? I think it was so close to the 14th, late in the 13th, and close enough that they were comfortable in saying, now on the 14th, or on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They were comfortable enough to say that because it was at hand. It was right there. It was about to begin. And then, so they went and prepared a place. Evidently, they got a meal ready, not a lamb. They didn't have time. They didn't have time to go sacrifice a lamb. I mean, isn't that awfully late in the day to be talking about, if it's an early 14th Passover, to say, where the Passover is going in a couple hours. Well, it's going to be ready. It's going to be time for the Passover. Where do we want to go do it this time? a little bit late for being asking a question like that. So no, they had these two things, I believe, in view. And then it tells us when the evening had come, so they had time for preparation. The evening had come, could mean when the evening had fully come. In other words, you go through the twilight period and then now you're in the darkness. He sat down with the 12. Now as they were eating, he said, "Assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me." And he goes on to tell, it tells how he institutes the memorial of his death. Now in Mark, we'll look again at Mark 14. And it says in verse 12 again, "Now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb," that's and true. You know, even though it is the first day of unleavened bread, or the 14th, not the 15th, but understand again the parlance, the use of language at this time, the beginning of the festival period. That is the day that they killed. It doesn't mean that they're going to kill it right then. A lot of people take, "Oh, you see, they were going to kill it right there as soon as the sun set." No. The 14th was about to begin, and that is the day on which they killed the Passover. So now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" I believe they had in mind, again, not only what they were going to do that night in beginning the Passover festival, but they were thinking in terms of the next night when they would eat the Passover lamb, because they didn't get it yet. And guess what? He was going to observe the Passover. Jesus was going to keep the Passover that year. He was going to be the Passover that year. He was going to be the Passover lamb, the ultimate Passover lamb, who would be sacrificed for all of us. And then again, it tells the same story. He sent his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. Wherever he goes in, say to the master of the house, 'The teacher says, where's the guest room in which I may eat Passover with my disciples?'" Now someone has pointed out, and I think it's a good point to make, he says, "which I may eat the Passover." He's not saying dogmatically he's going to eat the Passover, at least not the Passover sacrifice, but this is the place where he may do what they expect to do. Or this is where he can do it, in other words. "Then he will show you a large upper room." Now there's another upper room described in Acts the 2nd chapter, and it was big enough to hold a whole lot of people. So I would say that this large upper room was big enough to hold not only the 12, but also their families. And they were still anticipating that their families would be getting with them on the night of the 15th. But here, just the 12 were here on this night. They showed them a large upper room furnished and prepared there, and there they made ready. And there again in verse 17 it says, "In the evening he came with the 12." So once again, in the evening. So there's just a short period of time here. You don't have a lot of time to work with. There is no time to go and sacrifice a lamb at the temple. If the temple would have done it, and I don't think they would have. This would have had to have been a domestic sacrifice, but according to Deuteronomy 16, that is forbidden. You shall not do it in every place, but only at the place where the Lord your God places his name. And that's the temple, not just any place in Jerusalem. So in the evening he came with the 12, and he sat at eat, and Jesus, "Assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me," and so on. The same story. And then finally, again in Luke chapter 22, and here he says something quite interesting. Again, verse 7, "Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, 'Go and prepare the Passover that we may eat.' So they said to him, 'Where do you want us to prepare?' He said to them, 'Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters. Then you shall say to the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?'" Once again, that I may eat the Passover with my disciples. "Then he will show you a large furnished upper room. There make ready." So they went and found it just as he had said. Let's get on down to the time when he comes. It says, verse 14, "When the hour had come, he sat down and the 12 apostles with him. Then he said to them," now this is interesting, "with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Now do you remember what happened that night later when he was in the garden praying? You remember something he said? Father, if it's possible, take this cup away from me. Did he want to get out of it if he possibly could? Did he want to put it off, say, can we wait till next year? He knew he had to do it, but he said, if possible, remove this from me. And could he be saying something similar to that here? Could he be saying, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover, meaning what's going to happen tomorrow night, with you before I suffer? In other words, I don't want to suffer. For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Could he be saying that I wanted, with fervent desire, I wanted to celebrate this Passover with you as we have done in the past, but it's not going to happen. I wanted to put it off another year, or 2 years, or whatever. I wanted to put it off. I wanted to do this before I have to suffer. But I'm telling you, I will not eat of it with you again until it is fulfilled, and drink the fruit of this vine until it's fulfilled in the kingdom of God. So I think that that's probably what he's saying here. That he's not going to have the Passover this year. Not the statutory Passover. But you know what? It does seem to suggest that in the kingdom of God he is going to have it again with his disciples. That's what he suggests right here. I believe that's what's going on. Now, there are different ways of approaching this. I realize it could be interpreted differently, but I think that is the explanation I just gave you is consistent with the language that is used in the Greek here. I do know that. Now, let's talk just a few moments in closing about what we do. What we do. The memorial of Christ's death was instituted at the Last Supper, as we all know. It was not, I emphasize this, it was not a substitution for or replacement of the statutory Passover. You know, those in Acts 21, James pointed them out to Paul. He said, you see how many thousands of Jews there are who believe, and they're all zealous for the law. And they were offering sacrifices at the temple. They were still doing all that. And Paul didn't say, oh, they shouldn't be doing that. They shouldn't. Do you think the sacrifices they were offering included the annual Passover sacrifice? Yes, no doubt. No doubt it did. So they didn't perceive that they had to stop doing that. There's nothing wrong with that. So my point here is that the memorial of Christ's death was not given as a substitution for or a replacement of the statutory Passover. It's something different. Something different. It's new. We should do it in my view. I know people have a difference of opinion on this, but I say we should do it at the same night Christ instituted it, rather than try to align it with the statutory Passover. Because it is not the statutory Passover. It is not a replacement of the statutory Passover. It is a memorial newly instituted by Jesus Christ himself in the night of his betrayal. So I say we should do it the same night he did it. I think we're on safe grounds in doing that. I'm not going to condemn people who have a difference of opinion, but I think that's what we should do. Oh, and by the way, one thing I want to mention, I just learned about it yesterday. Somebody told me that someone was complaining about how we need to all be on the same page doctrinally, and they used an example of something one of our ministers said last year, I guess before Passover. He said that minister, and he's talking about me, he said that we should be keeping the Passover in the afternoon of the 14th. When have you ever heard me say that? I can tell you exactly how many times you've heard me say that. 0. I have never said that. I have always said that I think we should do it in the same night that Jesus instituted it. If you by Passover you mean the memorial of his death. And I don't have any problem calling it Passover or New Testament Passover, because after all we are looking to Christ our Passover who died for us. So I'm okay with calling it Passover. as long as we understand it is not the statutory Passover, which was a sacrificial offering that occurred on a particular day, namely the 14th, at a particular time of the day between the evenings. Okay, but anyway, I just thought about that before we get back to the concluding thoughts. So, again, we should do it, I believe, in the same night that Christ instituted, which was the beginning part of the 14th. It's still a part of the overall Passover festival. So again, I don't have any problem with the use of the word Passover in describing what we do. But I don't think we should try to align it, again, as I said, with the statutory Passover. Because by taking the bread and the wine, we're not only symbolizing the necessity of relying on Christ and His sacrificial work for salvation and spiritual sustenance. You eat a little bread, drink a little wine. That symbolizes, you're eating and drinking. You have to eat and drink to sustain life, don't you? So symbolically, we're saying what we're saying in doing this is that we rely on Christ for our spiritual salvation and sustenance. But we're also symbolizing our participation in His suffering and death, and His suffering began that night. We could say in one sense His whole life was a sacrifice, but especially on that night, that's when the suffering, the final suffering that led to His death, that's when it began. So to me, we should do that on that same night, because we are, again, not only relying on Him, not only looking back to Him but more than that, we should look on our lives as being a participation in the fellowship of His suffering. Let's look at it in Philippians chapter 3 in closing. Philippians chapter 3. I know I'm a few minutes over time, but anyway, Philippians chapter 3, verse 10, here Paul is talking about his goal. Paul's goal is, verse 10, that I may know Him and the power, meaning Christ, and the power of His resurrection and the fellowship of His sufferings, being conformed to His death. So the Apostle Paul understood that his whole life was a sacrifice, that everything, all of his drives, his emotions, everything about him, it was now given over to Christ. He was a participant now, not only looking to Christ and relying on Him for what He did for us, but also participating in His suffering. So he saw his own personal suffering, the persecutions he endured, the hardships he endured, and everything he had to endure through this life of struggle as a participation in the suffering of Christ. And so should we. We should see this as when we come together to memorialize Christ's death, we should remember that we are participants with Him in His suffering. So how appropriate it is that we take the symbols of His broken body and His shed blood on the same night that He instituted this wonderful memorial. I think it's very appropriate that we do it just the way He did and when He did it. And when we do that, I think we can reap the most benefit by it, especially understanding that we are not only dependent on Him for our sustenance, spiritual sustenance, but also that we are participants with Him in His suffering.